There is a place on this earth where the sand swallows everything. Secrets, borders, billions of dollars, entire agreements signed by heads of state. Even the truth itself gets buried here. Grain by grain, dune by dune, year after year, decade after decade, until nobody can find it anymore and the desert becomes its own kind of archive. Vast, silent, and completely closed to the outside world. It is called the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. And right now, beneath its absolute and overwhelming silence, two of the wealthiest and most powerful nations on the face of this planet are locked in a conflict that neither of them will ever admit is happening. A conflict that has no official name. A conflict that appears in no casualty reports and no peace negotiations. A conflict that is fought in maps, in oil wells, in proxy armies, and in the deliberate, patient language of borders that one country claims are final and another country has spent 50 years refusing to accept. You will not find this conflict in news bulletins. You will not hear it discussed openly at diplomatic summits. You will not see it addressed in any press conference. You will not read about it in any official government statement from either side, because the map itself is the weapon. And somewhere in that vast, burning ocean of red and gold sand, a line drawn by exhausted diplomats behind a closed door in 1974 sits directly on top of 14 billion barrels of oil. A line one country signed and ratified. A line the other country signed but has never accepted as final. A line that has never, not once in 50 years of formal independence, been fully agreed upon by both nations at the same time. This is the story of one of the most valuable secrets in the modern world, a border dispute hidden inside the largest sand desert on this planet. A story of oil wealth beyond imagination, of diplomatic betrayal in a closed room, of missing lawyers and a founding father who walked out of a negotiation believing one thing had been agreed while the paper in front of him said something completely different. A story of two brother nations, bound by religion, language, culture, and geography, slowly and quietly becoming something else. And it begins not with a battle, not with a declaration, not with an army. It begins with a single, straight, invisible line drawn across the sand by men who understood very well what was beneath it. The Rub al-Khali covers approximately 650,000 square kilometers of the southern Arabian Peninsula. Hold that number in your mind for a moment and let it expand into something real. That area is larger than France. It is larger than the state of Texas. It is the single largest continuous sand surface anywhere on Earth, and it sits like a furnace in the belly of Arabia, stretching across Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Yemen. In most of this desert, there is genuinely nothing. Temperatures in the summer interior regularly reach 56 degrees Celsius. Rainfall can measure 0 for 3 or 4 consecutive years. Sand dunes rise to heights of 300 meters, the equivalent of a 30-story building made entirely of shifting, unstable sand. There are no permanent rivers. There are no roads through the deep interior. There are no villages, no markets, no telephone lines, no signs of any kind. There is simply nothing. And that nothing, that absolute, searing, featureless, magnificent nothing, is exactly what makes this desert so strategically dangerous. Because when there's nothing visible on the surface, everything beneath it remains hidden. The oil stays hidden, the borders stay hidden, and the arguments stay hidden too. To understand how this dispute was born, you have to go back much further than 1974. You have to go back to a time before the United Arab Emirates existed as a country. A time when the entire interior of the Arabian Peninsula was a patchwork of competing tribal claims, British colonial boundary lines drawn on insufficient maps, and oil company surveys pushing into territory that no government fully controlled. In the early decades of the 20th century, the British Empire was the dominant external power along the Gulf Coast. The Trucial States, the collection of small sheikdoms that would eventually become the UAE in 1971, existed under British protection treaties. They had coastlines, they had ports, they had pearl diving traditions and emerging oil exploration rights. But their southern interior, the vast desert reaching toward the empty quarter, was genuinely undefined. Nobody had formally mapped it. Nobody had formally claimed every square kilometer of it. It was simply the desert. The desert belonged to whoever could hold it. To the west and south of these small coastal sheikdoms, the kingdom of Saudi Arabia under Ibn Saud was doing something remarkable. It was building a nation through a combination of conquest, negotiation, religious authority, and extraordinary personal energy. Saudi Arabia in the 1920s and 1930s was expanding its territorial reach with a consistency and an ambition that made its neighbors nervous. One of the most significant confrontations from this era centered on the Barremi Oasis, a fertile, strategically positioned area of date palms and wells sitting in the desert borderland between what is now Abu Dhabi, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi forces occupied Barremi in 1952, claiming it as rightfully theirs based on historical tribal allegiance. The British, acting on behalf of the Trucial States and Oman, challenged the claim through arbitration. When that arbitration collapsed, British-led forces expelled the Saudi garrison from Bahraini in 1955. Saudi Arabia was humiliated. The loss of Bahraini was deeply felt in Riyadh. It sat in the national memory like a splinter, too small to be visible, too sharp to be forgotten, and it would resurface at precisely the right diplomatic moment 19 years later. That moment arrived in 1974. The UAE had only just celebrated its third birthday as an independent federation. Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the founding father, the man whose vision had assembled 7 disparate sheikdoms into a single nation, was working around the clock to stabilize his new country. He needed international recognition. He needed functioning borders. He needed his massive, powerful Saudi neighbor to acknowledge his country's territorial integrity and stop pushing into its undefined southern margins. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, understood the geometry of the situation with perfect clarity. The UAE was new. It was vulnerable. It needed Saudi goodwill. And Saudi Arabia had its own list of things it wanted. At the top of that list was the formal, legal, internationally documented surrender of the Bahraini Oasis claim, and access to or control over what the oil surveys were beginning to reveal lay beneath the eastern empty quarter. Negotiators sat down in Jeddah behind closed doors. The session was private. There were no independent international observers. There were no cartographers on the UAE team. There were no petroleum engineers present to challenge the geographic descriptions being written into the text. There were no lawyers. Crucially, there were no lawyers on the Emirati side to read the fine print with the cold, professional eye that fine print demands. There were men in a room, talking, and a document taking shape around them that neither side would ever fully agree described what had actually been decided. The Treaty of Jeddah was signed. Saudi Arabia formally surrendered its claim to the Bahraini Oasis. The old wound officially closed, the national humiliation of 1955 finally addressed on paper. The UAE, in exchange, gave Saudi Arabia a 15-mile strip of coastline along the southern shore of the peninsula, a narrow corridor of desert separating the UAE from its neighbor, Qatar. This strip of coast seems minor on a map. It is not minor at all. We will return to it. And buried in the treaty's internal articles, in language that appeared routine and technical to anyone reading quickly, was Article 3. Article 3 stated with complete clarity that all hydrocarbons found in the Sheba Zarara oil field, a massive subsurface deposit sitting directly on or immediately south of the border, would belong entirely and exclusively to Saudi Arabia. The UAE would not explore it. The UAE would not drill it. The UAE would not receive a single barrel or a single rial from its production. Everything beneath that sand, on whatever side of the line it happened to lie, would go to Riyadh. And now the moment where the entire story fractures apart. Sheikh Zayed left that meeting believing something utterly different had been agreed. His advisors left believing something different. Even the British diplomatic officials, who were monitoring the negotiations from the margins, with their own interests carefully managed, understood that what had been verbally discussed was a unitization arrangement. Unitization is the standard, internationally accepted practice for oil reservoirs that cross international boundaries. You conduct a technical survey. You determine what percentage of the subsurface reservoir lies within each country's territory. You divide the production revenue accordingly. It is the legal default. It is what happens everywhere else in the world when an oil field straddles a border. Sheikh Zayed believed this was what had been agreed for Sheba. His technical team believed it. The British believed it. But Article 3 said something categorically different. Article 3 said that Saudi Arabia takes it all. No survey, no percentage, no sharing. Everything. By the time the UAE examined the signed document carefully enough to understand what Article 3 actually meant, it was 1975. The paper had been signed. The ceremony was done. The treaty existed. And the UAE had no lawyers in the room to catch the discrepancy before the pen met the document. That absence of lawyers, of cartographers, of technical experts, is one of the most consequential administrative failures in modern Gulf history. A founding nation, only 3 years old, sent diplomats into one of the most technically complex boundary negotiations in the region's history without the professional support structure that such a negotiation demanded. The cost of that absence is measured in billions of barrels of oil and counting. The UAE refused to ratify the treaty. That decision, quiet, deliberate, and maintained without interruption for 50 years, is the legal pulse of everything that follows. Saudi Arabia formally ratified the treaty in 1993 and registered it with the United Nations Treaty Series on the 9th of September of that year. From Riyadh's position, the border is legally settled. It has been internationally recorded. It is final and not open for discussion. From Abu Dhabi's position, the treaty was signed under circumstances that amounted to duress, a word that an Emirati Foreign Ministry official would actually use to the United States ambassador in 2004, describing the signing as a case of force majeure. And it does not reflect what was genuinely negotiated. One country says the border is closed, the other country says it was never properly opened. And between them, the oil accumulates. Look at the geography of the Sheba field with fresh eyes, and the scale of what is at stake becomes overwhelming. Sheba, which Abu Dhabi calls Zarara, a naming disagreement that is itself a political act, is classified as a supergiant oil field. The estimated proven reserves beneath the desert at Sheba exceed 14 billion barrels of crude oil and 25 trillion cubic feet of associated natural gas. At the oil prices of 2024 and 2025, that represents wealth measured not in billions, but in trillions of dollars, multiple trillions, wealth capable of funding entire national economies for generations. The field sits approximately 10 kilometers south of the UAE's border, as drawn on Saudi maps. But Abu Dhabi's own geological surveys, conducted by teams working from within the UAE, concluded that 80% of the subsurface reservoir extends northward into territory that the UAE considers its own. The oil reservoir does not follow the 1974 treaty line. It does not know which country drew which map. It simply sits there, pressurized and ancient and enormous, while two governments conduct a quiet, sustained 50-year argument about a line that one of them insists is final and the other insists was never legitimately drawn. When Saudi Aramco formally inaugurated the Sheba facility in June 1999, in a ceremony that celebrated a genuine engineering marvel, a world-class oil installation built against extraordinary logistical odds in the middle of one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the UAE responded in the most controlled and measured way available to a small nation with a serious grievance. Emirati officials boycotted the GCC oil ministers' meeting that Saudi Arabia hosted immediately after the inauguration. They did not attend, they sent no representative, they offered no public explanation on the record. They simply were not there. And within the closed, precise, carefully calibrated world of Gulf diplomacy, where the meanings behind absences are read with exactly the same attention that other diplomatic cultures give to formal statements, the message was received perfectly by everyone who needed to receive it. The UAE was making a demand without making a demand. It was asserting a right without filing a legal claim. It was saying, in the only language available to it at that moment, that it considered the oil production at Sheba to be taking place without its consent and without its fair share. Saudi Arabia acknowledged nothing. It offered nothing in return, and it continued to produce the oil at 500,000 barrels per day, while the diplomatic silence between the two countries on this specific subject deepened by the year. For years after that, the dispute maintained its surface silence. The GCC continued to function. Trade between the UAE and Saudi Arabia grew into one of the largest bilateral commercial relationships in the Arab world. Emirati and Saudi citizens crossed each other's borders in enormous numbers, for business, for family visits, for tourism. The two royal families maintained the public appearance of brotherhood. But in the background, in the technical departments of foreign ministries and in the private briefings of senior officials, the geography remained contested, the resentment remained intact. The dispute then moved from diplomatic silence into something more confrontational. In 2006, the official UAE yearbook was published. This is a government-produced document, authoritative and deliberate, not a commercial publication or an academic estimate. Inside it was a map of the UAE. That map showed the UAE's borders in a configuration that directly contradicted the 1974 treaty. The western border of the UAE extended further than Saudi Arabia acknowledged, and the southern border, drawn through the northeastern empty quarter, showed the Sheba field sitting inside UAE territory. It was not a cartographic error. Maps produced by governments at this level do not contain accidental boundary errors. This was a sovereign statement made in the language of geography, calibrated and intentional. The UAE was asserting, officially and publicly, that the 1974 treaty line was not its border. Saudi Arabia's response took 3 years to arrive, which itself tells you something about how carefully both governments managed this dispute. In 2009, Riyadh announced that Emirati citizens would no longer be permitted to enter Saudi Arabia using their Emirates ID cards. Passports would be required. This announcement sounds bureaucratic. It sounds like a minor administrative adjustment. It was not. Within the context of Gulf relations, where the ease of movement between neighboring states is both a practical necessity and a symbol of brotherly closeness, this was a declaration. It said that the relationship had conditions, that those conditions were geographic, that Saudi Arabia was prepared to disrupt the daily lives of millions of ordinary citizens across both countries to make a point about what was written on a government identification card's map. The UAE responded in exact kind. Saudi citizens would need passports to enter the UAE. The supposedly non-existent border suddenly had very real teeth. Now, let us examine the second major geographic flashpoint in this dispute, because it receives far less attention than Sheba, and it is every bit as strategically significant. When the 1974 Treaty of Jeddah transferred that 15-mile coastal strip to Saudi Arabia, it achieved something that geographers call territorial severance. It physically cut the UAE off from Qatar. There is no land route, none, not a single road, connecting Abu Dhabi to Doha that does not pass through Saudi territory. Two Gulf nations with deep historical ties, enormous commercial interdependencies, and centuries of shared culture cannot drive between each other without crossing a strip of Saudi sand that is barely wider than a large city. For decades, this was a manageable reality. Then, in 2005, both Qatar and the UAE began seriously discussing a causeway, a road and rail bridge crossing the shallow coastal waters, connecting their territories, bypassing the Saudi land corridor entirely. The proposed route would cross waters whose maritime boundary had never been formally agreed between all the relevant parties. Saudi Arabia immediately protested that the causeway would pass through Saudi maritime territory. The project was placed on indefinite hold. It has never been built. The causeway that would connect two friendly Gulf nations remains a discussion point year after year. While the Saudi coastal strip continues to perform exactly the strategic function it was designed to perform in 1974, keeping two of Saudi Arabia's neighbors separated from each other. The coastal geography also encompasses the extraordinary natural feature of Khor al-Udaid, known in English as the Inland Sea. This is one of the genuinely spectacular landscapes of the entire Arabian Peninsula. Where Saudi coastline meets Qatari territory, the desert drops into a complex system of saltwater channels and tidal lagoons that appear almost otherworldly from the air. Red dunes tumble directly into blue-green water. The Inland Sea has become a destination for Qatari tourists seeking dramatic natural scenery just outside Doha. But its political geography, the question of exactly where Saudi waters end and where Qatari and potentially UAE waters begin, remains formally unresolved. The natural beauty is undeniable. The legal situation beneath it is a tangle that nobody in the region is eager to cut through. Now carry this story forward in time, because the empty quarter dispute did not stay contained in the desert. It grew outward. It found new theaters. It became embedded in a broader strategic competition between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi that has been transforming the politics of the entire Arabian Peninsula through the 2020s. The causes of this competition are structural and deep-rooted, and they go far beyond a disagreement about sand and oil. OPEC production quotas became a consistent source of friction, the UAE repeatedly pushing for higher output ceilings that would benefit its own expanding production capacity, while Saudi Arabia prioritized price stability. The Abraham Accords of 2020, through which the UAE normalized relations with Israel, were pursued by Abu Dhabi largely independently of Saudi Arabia and created a new alignment in the Middle East that shifted the regional balance in ways that Riyadh found uncomfortable. Most visibly and most dramatically, Yemen became the arena where Saudi-Emirati competition turned into something approaching open proxy conflict. Saudi Arabia launched its military coalition in Yemen in 2015 with the stated objective of restoring the internationally recognized Yemeni government and containing the Houthi movement in the north. The UAE joined that coalition but pursued a simultaneous and partially separate agenda, identifying, funding, training, arming, and directing the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist political and military movement based in southern Yemen whose goal was an independent South Yemeni state, separate from both the Houthi north and the Saudi-backed government. The STC was an Emirati project in almost every meaningful sense. Its commanders were trained in UAE facilities. Its weapons came through UAE supply chains. Its political leadership coordinated closely with Abu Dhabi. And as the STC grew in strength and territorial ambition through the late 2010s and early 2020s, it began pushing eastward, into Yemen's Hadramaut region and then into Al-Mahra province, the far eastern corner of Yemen that borders directly onto Saudi Arabia and Oman. Al-Mahra's strategic importance is almost never explained clearly in Western coverage of Yemen, which tends to focus on the Houthi conflict in the north and the humanitarian crisis. But to understand Saudi thinking about the UAE, Al-Mahra is essential. Saudi Arabia has invested significantly in developing its oil pipeline infrastructure to reach the Arabian Sea coast through Yemen's east, providing an alternative export route that would allow Saudi oil to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which so much Gulf oil must currently pass, and which Iran holds the geographic ability to threaten. Al-Mahra is the land through which that strategic corridor must pass. If the UAE's proxy forces established firm control of Al-Mahra, they would effectively sit astride Saudi Arabia's most important strategic infrastructure project outside its own borders. By December 2025, the Southern Transitional Council launched a major military offensive in Hadramaut and Al-Mahra, seizing significant territory. Saudi Arabia's response was something that would have been genuinely unthinkable 10 years earlier. Saudi aircraft bombed the port of Al-Mukalla. Riyadh struck a target in a Yemeni port city to destroy what Saudi officials described as a UAE-linked weapons shipment destined for the STC. Saudi Arabia bombed an Emirati proxy force. A member of the GCC, a long-standing partner in the Yemen coalition, a fellow Sunni monarchy with which Saudi Arabia shares a formerly unresolved border, and Riyadh launched an airstrike against its forces. That moment in late 2025 was when the subtext of 50 years finally broke the surface. The border dispute in the Empty Quarter and the proxy war in Yemen are not two separate stories running in parallel. They are expressions of the same underlying reality. Two neighboring nations with a fundamentally unresolved territorial relationship, competing visions for regional leadership, and a growing list of grievances that accumulated quietly for decades and are now accumulating loudly. Running beneath all of this, unchanged and unresolved, is still the oil. Because Sheba is not the only geological story in the Empty Quarter. The entire northeastern section of the Rub al Khali rests on sedimentary formations that geologists consistently identify as highly promising for additional hydrocarbon discovery. What Aramco has found and developed at Sheba may be the most visible and currently productive expression of a much larger subsurface wealth that has not yet been fully surveyed, documented, or developed. The UAE's 50-year refusal to accept the 1974 border is not merely historical resentment. It is not sentiment. It is not bureaucratic inertia. It is, at least in part, a calculated position rooted in what Emirati geological surveys suggest may lie beneath the sand that Abu Dhabi considers its territory, but that Saudi Arabia claims as its own. There is also the quiet, daily reality of the Empty Quarter border crossing, Al-Rub al-Khali land port, a formal bilateral crossing point that has grown into one of the busiest commercial transit routes between the two countries. Billions of dollars of goods move through it every year. Trucks carry construction materials, consumer products, food, equipment. Drivers present their documents. Officials stamp the papers. The crossing functions. Trade happens. And not one official on either side of that crossing will state publicly, on the record, with geographic specificity, exactly where the legal border beneath their feet actually runs. The human geography of the dispute contains its own quiet truth. The Bedouin tribes of the Empty Quarter, the Bani Yas, the Manasir, the Dawasir, communities with roots in this desert that run back for centuries before the concept of a Gulf nation-state existed anywhere, do not experience the 1974 treaty line as a meaningful reality in their daily lives. Their traditional movement routes across the desert cross the international boundary the way a creek crosses a drainage ditch, without ceremony, without documentation, without the slightest acknowledgement that a sovereign border is being traversed. Their camels graze across what Saudi maps call Saudi territory and Emirati maps call Emirati territory, with complete and ancient indifference to the distinction. Their marriages connect families on both sides. Their market visits and seasonal movements and deep social structures predate the concept of national borders in this part of the world by thousands of years. The border is a political construction imposed on a social geography that preceded it by millennia and that continues to operate largely as if it does not exist at all. These people know the desert the way the diplomats in Jeddah in 1974 never did. They know where the water is, where the grazing is good, where the dunes shift in winter. What they do not know, what they have never needed to know, is which government's straight line they happen to be standing on at any particular moment. And yet those same communities are being slowly enrolled into the territorial logic of the dispute in ways their grandparents could not have anticipated. The UAE's systematic development of its southern territories, road construction extending toward the desert interior, solar energy infrastructure, tourism investment in the Liwa Oasis region near the border, and the steady expansion of Emirati administrative presence southward is pushing the Emirati state's physical footprint closer to the contested line. On the Saudi side, the infrastructure surrounding Sheba, the airport capable of receiving large commercial aircraft, the accommodation blocks for thousands of workers, the pipeline network extending northward toward Riyadh, the security installations, anchors Saudi state presence firmly in the northeastern Empty Quarter. Slowly, patiently, with the kind of long-term planning that governments with sovereign wealth funds and 50-year development visions can sustain, each country is making the desert less empty. Each road built, each facility constructed, each boundary marker planted in the sand constitutes a territorial fact. The conflict is being prosecuted in concrete and asphalt and infrastructure as surely as in legal arguments and map colors. What resolution of this dispute would look like is a question that nobody has answered convincingly. The treaty is registered with the United Nations. Saudi Arabia considers it final. But international law contains complex doctrines about agreements signed under conditions of inequality or coercion, and the UAE's consistent maintenance of its non-ratification position means it has never legally foreclosed the argument. A genuine renegotiation of the 1974 agreement would require Saudi Arabia to acknowledge that what it considers a settled legal fact was in reality a flawed negotiation, something no Saudi government has shown the smallest willingness to entertain. It would require the UAE to formalize the loss of territory and oil revenue that Emirati leaders have spent 5 decades quietly contesting. It would require both governments to have a candid public conversation about sovereignty, oil, and borders that their populations have never been prepared for through official discourse. There is no obvious path to resolution that both governments could walk simultaneously. There is only management, the careful maintenance of a functioning diplomatic surface over a structural dispute that neither country can afford to formally resolve, because resolution requires one of them to lose, and that neither country can afford to fully escalate, because escalation would damage the trade, the investment, the tourism, and the broader GCC architecture upon which both economies depend. But the structural drift between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, made visible by OPEC quota fights, Yemen proxy conflicts, competing infrastructure projects across Africa and the Horn, and diverging visions for the post-oil Gulf economy, is making that management progressively harder. Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is constructing a vision of national transformation centered on Saudi primacy, Saudi nationalism, and Saudi leadership of the Arab world. The UAE, under President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, has built a different vision, a globally connected, strategically autonomous, commercially aggressive state that competes on its own terms and defines its success not through pan-Arab solidarity, but through sheer economic performance and diplomatic flexibility. These are not complementary visions. At their foundations, they are competitive, and the empty quarter, that ancient, burning, boundless desert, sits at the geographic heart of that competition. Think about everything this desert has absorbed over the centuries, frankincense caravans reading the stars across its featureless surface. Bedouin families who understood the desert's language of wind and sand better than any instrument ever built. British colonial officers in the 1930s drawing their straight administrative lines with rulers and a confidence that their maps could not justify. Oil company geologists in the 1950s and 1960s probing beneath the surface with seismic equipment, their instruments revealing a black wealth that would reorder everything. Diplomats in a Jeddah room in 1974 writing a treaty that one party understood differently from the other. And now, in 2025 and 2026, drones and security convoys and pipeline monitoring equipment and satellite surveillance systems, all operating across the same sand in service of an argument that officially does not exist and that neither government will acknowledge in public. The world's attention is almost always elsewhere. The empty quarter does not produce the kind of images that drive global news cycles. There are no cities being destroyed here. There are no visible refugee movements. There are no dramatic satellite photographs of military buildups along a clearly marked line. There is only sand, endless, sculptural, overwhelming, indifferent sand, and somewhere within it, a border that one country drew and another country quietly erased, dividing a wealth that nature deposited here long before either nation existed, long before either flag was designed, long before either government was imagined. What we know with certainty, after all the history and all the geography and all the diplomatic silence, is this. 2 of the richest, most powerful, most globally connected countries in the Arab world share a border that one of them considers legally final and the other has never formally accepted. Beneath that border sits one of the largest oil fields ever discovered. The founding father of one nation left a treaty negotiation in 1974, believing something different had been agreed than what the document actually said. And his country has spent 50 years maintaining that position with a quiet consistency that speaks to how deeply the grievance runs. The other country registered that treaty with the United Nations, published it as international law, and considers the matter permanently closed. Between those two positions, one documented and internationally registered, one disputed and politically alive, lies an ocean of sand and an ocean of oil, and 50 years of accumulated silence where a genuine resolution should have been built but never was. Neither country has shown any willingness to cross the distance between those two positions. Neither country has found a way to give the other enough of what it needs for a compromise to survive. So the silence continues, and the oil continues, and the desert, which was here before both of them, continues to wait. The sand covers everything. It always has. It covered the caravan routes and the tribal boundaries and the colonial lines drawn by British officers who had never set foot in the terrain they were dividing. It covered the oil surveys and the seismic readings and the geological reports that first revealed what was hiding beneath the desert floor. It will cover the treaty arguments and the proxy wars and the map disputes too, eventually, the way it covers everything the Arabian Peninsula has tried to contain inside itself. Slowly, completely, without ceremony, without acknowledgement. But before it does, the oil will continue to be pumped. The infrastructure on both sides will continue to grow and expand toward each other across the sand. The border facts on the ground will continue to accumulate, one road, one facility, one security post at a time, and two nations that once stood together at the founding of a new Gulf order, that once called each other brothers without hesitation or qualification will continue their quiet, patient, extraordinarily disciplined, 50-year argument about a line drawn in the desert by men who did not all agree in the same room at the same moment on what they had decided. The empty quarter is not empty. It never was. Beneath the surface, it holds the compressed wealth of ancient organic matter transformed over millions of years into the fuel that built the modern world. Above the surface, it holds the weight of a diplomatic betrayal that has never been acknowledged, a legal argument that has never been resolved, and a silence that has been maintained so long and so carefully that it has taken on the quality of permanence. The desert holds all of it without complaint, indifferent, burning, boundless, and completely, deliberately, magnificently closed.